The church was filled with sunlight that streamed through the tall stained glass windows, casting colors of red, blue, and gold onto the polished wooden floor. The air carried the scent of fresh flowers, roses and lilies arranged neatly at the ends of each pew. Guests sat in hushed excitement, whispering to one another about how beautiful the bride looked, how handsome the groom was, and how perfect the day seemed. For many, this wedding felt like the beginning of a storybook life, the kind of moment people dreamed of but rarely saw. The bride stood at the altar in her flowing white dress, holding a bouquet of white and pink roses. Her hair was carefully styled, her smile wide and full of joy. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation as she looked around at the people gathered to witness her vows. For her, this was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the moment where promises would be sealed forever. The groom stood tall beside her, wearing a sharp navy blue suit. His tie matched the flowers in her bouquet, a detail many guests admired. He wore confidence like a second skin, his expression calm, almost too calm, as though he had rehearsed this role many times before. To the guests, he seemed like the perfect partner, successful, charming, and steady. But beneath his polished appearance, there was a flicker in his eyes that not everyone caught. The priest began to speak, his voice echoing warmly through the church. The couple clasped hands and everyone leaned forward in quiet anticipation. The moment was delicate, filled with beauty and tradition. Mothers dabbed their eyes with tissues, fathers shifted in their seats, and friends smiled with admiration. Among the guests sat a woman, not in silk or lace, but in a simple pale blue dress. She was the maid, a woman who had worked for the groom's family for years. She had helped with cleaning, cooking, and caring for the household, often working long hours for little recognition. On most days, she blended into the background unnoticed by those around her. Today, however, her heart beat faster than anyone else's in that church. Sitting beside her was her young daughter, no more than 7 years old, wearing a dress she had outgrown but cherished. The maid's daughter had wide eyes that scanned the altar with a mixture of fear and determination. She tugged at her mother's arm, whispering urgently. The mother shook her head gently, signaling for her to stay quiet. But the girl's small hands clenched tightly and her eyes filled with tears. She could not sit still. Her young mind carried a secret so heavy that even adults would struggle to hold it. As the vows were about to begin, the church doors seemed to close tighter, the air growing heavier. The priest spoke of love and unity, of two souls joining as one. The bride squeezed the groom's hand, smiling brightly. The groom tilted his head and returned her smile with practiced ease. The guests sighed softly, savoring the picture-perfect scene. But then, a sound cut through the calm like a knife. A high-pitched voice echoed across the church, filled with urgency and raw fear. It was the maid's daughter, her small frame suddenly running down the aisle toward the altar. Her shoes tapped loudly against the floor, her arms swinging as if every ounce of courage she had was pushing her forward. "Mom, don't let them marry," she screamed, her voice trembling but strong enough to silence the entire room. The words struck the air like thunder. Gasps rose from the guests. The bride froze in place and the groom's confident smile faltered. The priest looked confused, lowering his book, and the bride's parents turned sharply in their seats. Every eye in the church was now fixed on the little girl standing at the center of the aisle, tears streaming down her cheeks. The bride's bouquet slipped slightly in her hands. Her smile faded into shock. Her heart began to pound in her chest as she stared at the child. For a brief moment, she thought it might be a misunderstanding, a child overwhelmed by the attention or caught up in the emotion of the day. But something in the girl's eyes told her otherwise. There was no mischief there, no playful interruption. There was only fear, urgency, and a kind of truth that only innocence could carry. The guests whispered in confusion. Some chuckled awkwardly, thinking it was a childish outburst. Others frowned, sensing a weight behind the words that was not ordinary. The maid, still seated, turned pale, her hands shaking as she realized what her daughter had done. She wanted to rush forward to pull her back to hush her cries, but she could not move. It was as if her body was frozen by the moment she had long dreaded. The bride's eyes darted between the little girl and the groom. She whispered softly, "What is this?" But the groom did not answer. His jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed just slightly, a flash of frustration breaking through his composed mask. He forced a smile for the guests, trying to laugh off the interruption. "She's just a child," he said smoothly. though his voice carried a strained edge. "You know how children are, they say things they don't mean." But the girl's voice rose again, stronger this time, shaking with emotion. "No, Mom, please. Don't let them marry." Her cries echoed through the church once more, leaving no one unmoved. The bride clutched her bouquet tighter, her knuckles turning white. Her mind raced, her heart torn between the dream she had been promised and the possibility that it was crumbling before her eyes. In that moment, the perfection of the wedding day cracked. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows no longer looked warm and inviting. It looked sharp, almost accusing. The guests' smiles faded into uneasy frowns. The priest shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to proceed. The maid's daughter stood alone in the aisle, trembling but unyielding, her voice having pierced the silence in a way no one could ignore. And though she was small, her words carried a power that stopped an entire wedding in its tracks. What secret did she hold? Why did her voice sound so desperate? And why did her mother, the quiet maid who had never raised her voice in all her years of service, sit frozen with tears in her eyes? The wedding that was supposed to mark the beginning of a beautiful future now teetered on the edge of revelation. And as the church held its breath, everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. The church had never felt so quiet, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. The little girl's voice still echoed in the air. "Mom, don't let them marry." Words that felt heavier than stone, words that clung to every heart present. The bride stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her wide eyes darting between the child and the man she was moments away from calling her husband. The groom, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, his polished smile faltering as murmurs spread through the rows of guests. Some chuckled nervously, whispering that children often act out at big events, but others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing a truth hidden in the girl's trembling tone. The maid, sitting midway down the aisle, felt her heart sink as all eyes turned toward her. For years she had worked in silence, cleaning floors, folding linens, cooking meals, raising her daughter quietly in the shadows of other people's wealth. She had taught her child to keep her head down, to endure hardship with grace, but today her daughter's voice broke the barrier she had so carefully built. The maid's hand shook, her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to gather her child, to shield her from the stares, but something inside her told her that this moment was bigger than both of them, that silencing her daughter would mean carrying the same burden of silence forever. The little girl's eyes overflowed with tears as she stood at the center of the aisle, her dress wrinkled from the run, her shoes slightly scuffed, yet her courage unmatched. "Please," she cried, her voice rising, "please don't let them marry." She turned to her mother, who still sat frozen, and then back to the altar, where the bride's confusion deepened by the second. The bride, who had spent months dreaming of this day, felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting. She had imagined flowers, promises, and laughter, not fear, not a child screaming at her moment of joy. Yet something deep within her, a quiet voice she had ignored before, told her this was not a scene of childish mischief, but a warning she could not dismiss. The groom forced a small laugh, trying to brush it away. "She is just overwhelmed," he said, his tone dripping with forced calm. "Weddings can be a lot for little ones. Come on, sweetheart, go back to your seat." But the child shook her head fiercely, her curls bouncing as she cried out again. "No, he is not good. Please, you cannot marry him." The words sliced through the room like lightning. Guests gasped, their curiosity turning into suspicion. Some leaned forward, watching the groom's face closely, noticing the slight twitch in his jaw, the tightness in his fists. He had always been charming, but now cracks began to show. The bride's voice wavered as she finally asked, "What does she mean?" She looked into the groom's eyes, searching for answers, but found only irritation masked behind a fragile smile. "It is nothing," he replied too quickly, his voice sharp at the edges. "Children say things they do not understand." But the more he tried to dismiss it, the more the bride's heart told her something was wrong. She turned to the little girl, who was still trembling but unrelenting. "Sweetheart," the bride whispered softly, her tone gentle. "What are you trying to tell me?" The maid closed her eyes for a moment, her heart breaking. She had never wanted this truth to come out here in front of so many eyes, but she could see her daughter's determination. Her daughter had carried a memory she could not erase, a memory that no child should have to hold. The maid's silence for years had been out of fear. Fear of losing her job, fear of being branded a liar, fear of the powerful family that employed her. But as she looked at her daughter, standing so small yet so fierce, she knew the truth had already begun to spill. The groom cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to seize control of the moment. "Father," he said to the priest, "perhaps we should continue. This is a distraction, nothing more." But no one moved. The priest shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of the interruption, unwilling to proceed while a child stood in the aisle pleading with such desperation. The guests whispered louder now, their eyes narrowing, their once celebratory expressions turning into doubt. The bride's father rose from his seat. His protective instincts ignited and demanded in a stern voice, "Someone explain what is going on here." The little girl wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked straight at the bride. "He hurt us," she whispered, her voice small but echoing through the silence. "He is not who you think he is." The room stilled even more, the words hanging in the air like heavy clouds. The bride's hands shook so badly that the bouquet nearly slipped from her grip. Her mind flashed back to small moments. Times the groom had been impatient, times his charm seemed forced, times her instincts had whispered doubts she had brushed aside. Now those whispers felt like warnings she had ignored. The maid finally stood, her knees weak but her resolve rising. She walked slowly toward her daughter, every step feeling like a battle. She wanted to protect her child, to comfort her. But she also knew that this moment demanded honesty. Her daughter had broken the silence she had endured for too long. Standing in front of the church, she looked at the bride, her voice trembling but clear. "There are things you do not know," she said softly. "Things I have kept hidden because I thought it was safer that way. But my daughter has spoken and I cannot keep quiet anymore." Gasps spread across the pews. The bride's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She turned to look at the man she was supposed to marry, searching for reassurance, but all she saw was coldness in his eyes. She had wanted to believe in the fairy tale, but now she stood at the edge of something darker, something real. The groom raised his voice, his calm mask slipping. "This is ridiculous. Lies and nonsense from people who do not understand boundaries." His anger filled the church, but instead of silencing the room, it made the guests lean further into their suspicions. They had never seen him lose control, but here, his polished charm was cracking, and through the cracks something unsettling shone. The bride's voice broke as she whispered again, "What does she mean? What are you hiding?" But the groom did not answer, only pressed his lips together and glared at the maid and her daughter as though their very presence had destroyed the illusion he had built. The silence that followed was not empty but heavy with meaning. Everyone knew, even without details, that a truth long buried was about to surface. The little girl clung to her mother's hand, her tears still falling but her eyes burning with courage. And the bride, though her heart was breaking, understood one thing clearly. The perfect picture of her wedding had shattered, and what stood in its place was something far more real, something she could not ignore. The vows were forgotten, the celebration paused. Every guest sat in the tension of waiting to hear the truth that had already begun to rise. And in that church on that day, it became clear that sometimes it is not the priest or the parents or the lovers themselves who decide the fate of a marriage. Sometimes it is the smallest voice, trembling yet fearless, that holds the power to stop a lifetime mistake. The church was still frozen in disbelief after the little girl's words, but now all eyes shifted toward the maid. She stood in the aisle, one hand holding her daughter's while the other clutched nervously at the fabric of her simple dress. Her face was pale and her lips trembled, but her eyes carried a storm that she had held back for years. She had never wanted this moment. She had spent her life trying to avoid attention, living quietly in the shadows of the wealthy family she worked for, but silence could no longer protect her. Her daughter had spoken the words she had feared, and now there was no turning back. The bride's breathing grew uneven as she looked at the maid. Her chest tightened with every passing second, and though she desperately wanted to believe that everything was a misunderstanding, the weight in the room told her otherwise. She glanced at the groom, hoping he would take her hand and calm the situation with love and honesty, but instead his jaw was clenched, his eyes sharp, and his hand twitched at his side as though struggling to hold back his frustration. That expression told her more than words ever could. The guests leaned forward, whispering softly, their voices rising like the rustle of wind in a forest. They were no longer certain about the story they had come to celebrate. The church, once filled with excitement and warmth, now seemed filled with suspicion and fear. The priest held his book tightly, his eyes darting between the couple, the maid and her child. He had guided many weddings in his years, but never had he faced such a moment where vows were about to be overshadowed by secrets. The maid took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak. "I never wanted this to come out this way," she said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "For years I kept quiet because I thought it was safer to remain silent. I thought if I endured, if I stayed invisible, things would pass. But my daughter has carried a truth that no child should ever carry, and she has spoken it here in front of you all, and now I cannot deny it any longer." The bride's hands trembled so badly that the bouquet finally slipped from her grip and landed softly on the church floor. She did not even flinch at the sound. Her eyes were locked on the maid, her voice barely above a whisper. "What truth?" she asked. "What are you saying?" The maid hesitated, her gaze shifting to the groom. His eyes burned into hers with fury, but she no longer looked away. For years she had lowered her head in his presence, swallowed her pride, and ignored the sting of his words and the weight of his coldness. But standing here now with her daughter beside her, she realized that silence had only allowed him to hold power. She realized that if she continued to stay quiet, the bride standing at the altar would walk into the same trap she had endured for so long. The groom's voice cut sharply through the silence. "Do not listen to her. She is lying. She is bitter. She is trying to ruin our happiness." His words were loud and commanding, but they carried no warmth. They fell flat against the tension in the room. He had always been careful to present himself as charming and respectful, but now the mask was slipping, and people saw the anger beneath. The maid's daughter clung to her hand and whispered, "Please, Mom, tell them." And in that moment, the maid realized that this was no longer about her alone. Her daughter had been brave enough to speak the words she could not. Now it was her turn to honor that courage. She lifted her chin and spoke with a voice that grew steadier with each word. "You all see him as a man of success, of charm, of kindness. But behind closed doors, he is not the man you think he is. He has treated those beneath him with cruelty. He has spoken words that cut like knives. He has a temper that he hides from the world, but it is a temper that my daughter and I know too well. He is not gentle. He is not kind. And if you allow this marriage to happen, you will be binding her life to a man who hides darkness behind his smile." The church erupted with gasps. Some guests covered their mouths, others shook their heads, unable to believe what they were hearing. The bride felt her knees weaken. She had loved him, trusted him, planned a life with him, and now her heart was being pierced by the possibility that everything she believed was a carefully crafted illusion. The groom stepped forward, anger spilling from his voice. "This is slander. She is nothing but a servant, and now she dares to stand here and spread lies?" But even as he spoke, his words betrayed him. The dismissiveness, the lack of respect, the sharpness of his tone, it all revealed the truth he was trying so hard to hide. The guests exchanged glances, and the bride's father narrowed his eyes, suddenly remembering moments he had ignored before. Moments when the groom's politeness seemed forced. Moments when his smile seemed rehearsed. The maid pressed on, her voice no longer trembling. "You can call me a servant, and yes, I have served your family faithfully for years. I have worked quietly, asking for nothing but the chance to feed my daughter. But my dignity is still mine, and my daughter's safety is still mine to protect. And I will not let her grow up believing that silence is strength. I will not let her think that hiding the truth is what it means to survive." Her voice cracked, but her resolve did not. The truth is ugly, but it is better than a beautiful lie. Tears welled in the bride's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She felt the dream she had carried collapse, but beneath the grief there was also clarity. She looked at the man she thought she loved and saw for the first time, not the partner she had hoped for, but the stranger he truly was. The groom tried to regain control, his voice booming through the church. "You all will regret listening to her. She is nothing, and her words mean nothing." But the more he spoke, the more hollow his power sounded. The guest did not look convinced. The maid's daughter, small yet fearless, looked at him with eyes full of defiance, and the bride, though trembling, began to see clearly. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer filled with confusion. It was filled with truth, a truth that had lived in the shadows for too long. And though the maid's hand still shook, she felt a strange relief wash over her. She had spoken. Her daughter had been heard. And now the bride had the choice that could change everything. The church, once filled with celebration, had transformed into a courtroom of hearts, where truth and lies battled before everyone's eyes. And in that sacred place, the maid realized that courage was not found in silence. but in the moment you finally chose to speak, no matter how much it cost. The church was no longer a place of celebration. It had become heavy, charged with tension that no one could ignore. The silence inside was broken only by the faint sound of the maid's daughter sniffling as she clung tightly to her mother's hand. The truth had been spoken, and though it was fragile, it carried more weight than the groom's booming voice or his sharp denials. The bride stood at the altar, her white gown glowing under the stained glass light, but her heart felt dark and uncertain. This was supposed to be her perfect day, the moment she had been waiting for, yet all she felt was fear. The groom, realizing that his control over the room was slipping, adjusted his posture and forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. He spread his arms slightly, addressing the guests with a voice that tried to sound steady. "Everyone here knows me. You have seen me grow, you have worked with me, you have celebrated with me. Are you really going to let the words of a maid and her child erase all that you know about me?" His tone was calm on the surface, but underneath was a desperate edge that did not escape the ears of those listening. Some guests nodded nervously, eager to believe him, but others exchanged glances. It was true that many had known him for years, but how much had they really known? Charm could be a mask, and success could cover cracks no one wanted to see. The maid's words had planted a seed of doubt, and doubt was stronger than denial. The bride's father stepped forward, his face stern. He looked at the groom, then at the maid, then finally at his daughter. "I need to know," he said firmly, "if what has been spoken holds truth. This is not a game, and this is not just a moment. A marriage is a lifetime." His words echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. The groom's jaw tightened and his smile wavered again. The bride's hands shook at her sides. She could not stop replaying the little girl's cries in her head, the desperation in her voice. Children could be innocent, but they rarely carried such raw fear without reason. She remembered times when the groom had been short-tempered, times when he had dismissed others, times when he had said things she brushed off as stress or frustration. But now, standing in this moment, she realized they were pieces of a larger picture she had refused to see. The maid's daughter looked up at the bride with wide, tear-filled eyes. "He will hurt you," she whispered, barely audible, but the quietness made the words even heavier. The bride's knees weakened, and she felt as if the church floor might open beneath her. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the dream she had built, but the voice of the child carried a truth stronger than her longing. The groom, sensing his image slipping further, turned to the bride and lowered his voice so only she and those closest could hear. "Do not listen to them," he hissed softly, though his smile stayed plastered for the crowd. "They are beneath us. They are trying to take this moment away from you. From us. Do not let them." His words, instead of reassuring her, sent a chill down her spine. The sharpness, the dismissal, the coldness hidden beneath the surface, it was exactly what the maid had described. For the first time she saw it not as stress, but as a glimpse of the man behind the mask. The priest cleared his throat, his hands trembling as he clutched his book. He had never been in such a situation. His duty was to unite two souls, not to weigh truth and lies in front of a congregation. Yet even he hesitated to continue, sensing that rushing forward would be wrong. He looked at the bride, waiting for her signal, but her eyes were distant, locked on the small child who had stopped everything with a single plea. The guests were no longer whispering. They sat in uneasy silence, watching, waiting. They could not look away from the unfolding scene. The joy they had expected was gone, replaced by tension so thick it pressed on every chest. The groom, desperate now, raised his voice again. "Do you not see what is happening? This is jealousy. This is bitterness. She has worked in my family's house for years, and now, instead of being grateful, she is trying to destroy me on my wedding day. Is this the kind of story you want to believe?" His voice grew louder, sharper. "A servant's lies or the truth of the man you all know?" The bride's mother placed a hand on her daughter's arm. "You do not have to answer now," she whispered gently, her voice breaking. But the bride shook her head. She knew that the moment for answers was now. She could not move forward without facing the truth. To pretend would mean a lifetime of questions she could never silence. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned to the maid. "Please," she said, her voice raw, "tell me everything. Tell me what you know." The maid's chest rose and fell with a heavy breath. She had feared this moment more than any other. Speaking meant losing security, losing peace, perhaps even losing her work. But as she looked at her daughter, holding her hand so tightly she knew silence was no longer an option, she nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the bride's. "He is not the man you believe him to be," she said, her voice steady now, stronger. "Behind his charm there is cruelty. He has spoken words that no woman should hear, treated people as though they were nothing. And my daughter," her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "My daughter saw it. She felt it. That is why she could not stay silent today. She could not watch you walk into a life that would be filled with the same pain." The bride pressed a hand to her mouth, her tears flowing freely now. She wanted to collapse, to run, to disappear. But she stood rooted to the spot, her heart breaking with every word. The groom's anger flared again, but his denials now sounded empty. Every word he spoke revealed more of the mask peeling away, until all that remained was the truth he had tried so hard to hide. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could no longer ignore what was before them. They had seen enough to doubt, and doubt was all it took to crack the perfect picture. The maid's daughter, though small, stood tall in her bravery. She had given her voice to protect someone she barely knew but felt connected to, and in that moment she was the strongest person in the room. The bride's father stepped closer, his face red with anger, not at the maid, not at the child, but at the groom. "If there is even a chance that what has been said is true," he said firmly, "then this cannot continue." His voice rang with authority, and many guests nodded in agreement. The groom's mask finally shattered. His polished demeanor was gone, replaced by the raw edge of his frustration. He glared at the maid and her daughter, his lips pressed tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He said nothing, but his silence revealed more than any words could. The bride looked at him one last time, searching his eyes for a trace of love, of honesty, of the man she had once believed in. But all she saw was coldness. She turned away, her shoulders shaking, her tears falling, but her voice clear. "I cannot marry you." The church gasped as her words echoed, final and unshakable. The bouquet lay forgotten on the floor, the vows unsaid, but the truth had been spoken. The wedding that was supposed to mark the beginning of a life together had instead revealed the cracks that would have destroyed her future. And though her heart was breaking, there was also strength in her voice. Strength she did not know she carried until this moment. For the first time she listened not to the promises of charm, but to the warning of truth, even when it came from the smallest voice in the room. The groom stood frozen, his mask in pieces, while the bride, the maid, and the child became bound together not by ceremony but by courage. The moment the bride's voice echoed across the church declaring that she could not marry him, the air inside the walls seemed to shift. The sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows no longer painted soft colors of celebration, but instead shone harshly, as if illuminating every shadow that had been hidden. The guests sat in stunned silence, their hands frozen in place, their eyes darting between the bride who stood trembling, the maid clutching her daughter tightly, and the groom whose face betrayed the cracks in his carefully polished mask. The groom's voice broke through the silence, sharp and forceful. "This is madness," he shouted, his calm facade gone. "She is trying to destroy me with lies. Lies from a servant and a child, and you are all foolish enough to believe them?" His words carried anger, but beneath the anger was something else, fear. It was faint, buried deep, but it pulsed through his tone in a way no one could ignore. The bride looked at him, her tears flowing freely, her heart breaking with the realization that the man she thought she knew was slipping further and further away. "Then tell me the truth," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear enough to be heard. "If they are lying, then tell me what it is they could possibly gain by standing here, humiliating themselves before everyone. Tell me why a little girl would cry out with such fear if there was no reason." The groom opened his mouth, but the words did not come. His silence stretched like an invisible chain across the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably, watching him struggle, watching the anger in his eyes replace the honesty that should have been there. For the first time, many of them saw not the charming, successful man they admired, but the coldness beneath, the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. The maid's daughter pressed her face into her mother's side, but she did not let go of her hand. She had spoken the words that could not be taken back, and though her small body shook with fear, her heart held steady. The bride bent slightly, meeting the girl's eyes, her voice gentle. "Tell me," she said softly, "what is it you are so afraid of?" The child looked up, her cheeks wet with tears, her voice a whisper but strong enough for every ear to hear. "He is not kind," she said, her words halting but true. "He says things when no one else is there. He looks at us like we are nothing. I heard him tell my mother that people like us should stay silent, that we do not matter. I was so scared and I never forgot. And when I saw you standing here today, I could not let you marry him." Gasps filled the church. Some guests covered their mouths, others shook their heads, but all of them felt the weight of the little girl's words. Children did not carry grudges. Children did not invent such pain. Her innocence made her testimony more powerful than any adult's could ever be. The maid, tears streaming down her face, added softly, "She remembers what I tried so hard to forget, what I tried to bury to protect her. I thought silence would keep us safe, but silence only gave him power. Today she has done what I could not. She has spoken." The bride's father stepped forward, his fists clenched, his face red with both anger and sorrow. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice strong and commanding as he faced the groom. "Did you speak these words? Did you treat them this way?" The groom's lips curled and his voice came out harsh. "They are nothing. Servants and children speaking nonsense. I do not have to defend myself against such filth." The moment the words left his mouth, the church gasped again. His attempt to defend himself had instead confirmed the accusations. His tone, his words, the disdain dripping from his voice, it was the mask slipping completely. The truth was not spoken in the maid's trembling voice, nor in her daughter's tears, but in his very denial. The bride staggered backward, her heart shattering. She had dreamed of a future with him, a life built on love, respect, and partnership, but now she saw clearly. What the maid and her daughter revealed was not only a secret, but the true man who had always stood before her, hidden behind charm and wealth. She pressed her hands to her face, her sobs filling the silent church, and whispered, "How could I not see it before?" The guests looked on, their own illusions broken. They had admired him, envied him even, but now they felt shame for not seeing what had been there all along. Some lowered their heads, others shook them in disappointment. But all knew that this day would be remembered not for the wedding, but for the unveiling of truth. The maid wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close, whispering, "You were brave. You did the right thing." Her voice cracked with both pride and pain. She knew the cost of speaking out, but she also knew that courage was worth every risk. The bride, gathering her strength, lifted her head. Her tears still streamed, but her voice was steady as she looked at the maid and her daughter. "Thank you," she said, her words clear. "Thank you for saving me from a lifetime of pain. Thank you for speaking when no one else could." She turned then to the groom, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "You wanted me to stand before everyone and vow my life to you. But today I see the truth, and I will not bind myself to lies. This marriage is over before it ever began." The groom's face twisted with fury, but he was powerless. His words had betrayed him, his mask was gone, and the people who once admired him now saw only arrogance and cruelty. He stormed out of the church, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor, leaving behind the life he had tried to build with lies. The silence he left behind was thick, but it was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with relief, with the knowledge that the truth had been spoken and the bride had chosen courage over comfort. Guests slowly rose to their feet, some moving to comfort the bride, others whispering about the lesson they had just witnessed. The maid held her daughter tightly, her tears falling freely, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had lived in silence for so long, but today, because of her child, the truth had finally seen the light. The bride stepped down from the altar and walked toward them. She knelt before the little girl, her veil brushing the floor, and took her small hands gently in hers. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You gave me a gift no one else could, the gift of truth. I will never forget this." The child sniffled and managed a small smile, her courage shining through her tears. The guests looked on, many with tears of their own, moved by the bravery of a child who had changed the course of a woman's life with a single cry. In that church, on that day, the truth had been revealed, and though it broke hearts, it also set people free. It was not a day of vows and promises, but a day of lessons. Lessons about courage, honesty, and the power of even the smallest voice to make a difference. And as the bride stood surrounded by those who now truly saw her pain, she realized that sometimes the greatest blessings come not from perfect days, but from imperfect truths. The groom's footsteps faded as he stormed out of the church, leaving behind silence that seemed to press against every wall. The guests sat frozen, their eyes wide, their hearts unsettled by the sudden collapse of what was supposed to be a joyous day. The bride stood in the aisle, her gown heavy on her trembling body, her face wet with tears. She felt as though she had stepped into a dream that had twisted into a nightmare. Yet within that nightmare there was also clarity she had never known before. The truth had broken the illusion, and though it cut deep, it also freed her from a future built on lies. The maid still clutched her daughter tightly, whispering comfort into her ear. She had expected shame, rejection, perhaps even punishment for speaking up. But instead she felt something else rising in her chest. Pride. Her daughter had been the one to open the door, to break the silence she had carried for years. She realized now that courage often came from the unlikeliest of places, and that truth, no matter how small the voice that carried it, had a way of echoing louder than deceit. The bride turned slowly, facing the crowd that had gathered for her wedding. Her parents were there, her friends, her family, all of them watching her with a mixture of sympathy and expectation. She knew they wanted answers, perhaps even reassurance that she would recover from this collapse. Her heart beat heavily in her chest, but she took a deep breath and spoke. "I know you all came here today to see me begin a new life," she said, her voice raw but steady. "But sometimes life does not follow the path we plan. Sometimes the truth comes to light in ways we cannot predict. And though this day is not what I dreamed, I believe it is better this way, because I would rather stand here with a broken heart than spend a lifetime in chains." Her words carried through the church, settling on every ear, soft yet powerful. The guests shifted in their seats, some wiping tears, others nodding slowly. They had come to celebrate a marriage, but instead they had witnessed the strength of a woman choosing honesty over illusion, courage over fear. The bride's mother rushed forward and embraced her tightly, holding her as though she were a child again. "You are stronger than you know," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her father stood nearby, his eyes filled with pride, though he struggled to hold back his own anger at the man who had deceived them all. The bride pulled back from her mother's embrace and turned once more to the maid and her daughter. She walked toward them, each step heavy with emotion, until she stood directly before the little girl who had changed everything. Kneeling down so their eyes met, she took the child's small hands in her own. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You may not understand now how much your courage means, but you gave me the greatest gift anyone could give, the truth. I will never forget you, and I will never forget what you did for me." The little girl sniffled, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I was scared, but I did not want you to be sad like my mom." Her innocence pierced through the heaviness of the moment, reminding everyone that even the smallest heart could carry wisdom beyond its years. The bride smiled through her tears and kissed the child's forehead, holding her close for a moment before standing again. The maid lowered her eyes, ashamed that she had stayed silent for so long, but the bride reached for her hand. "Do not be ashamed," she said firmly. "You endured what many could not, and today you gave me the chance to see the truth before it was too late. You have more strength than you realize, and your daughter has inherited that strength from you." The maid's tears flowed freely now, but this time they were not only tears of fear, they were also tears of release, of a weight finally lifted after years of silence. The guests began to murmur again, but this time their whispers carried compassion. They no longer looked at the maid and her daughter as outsiders. They saw them as the very reason the truth had come to light. Some even rose to their feet, offering small nods of respect, acknowledging the bravery it took for them to stand against someone so powerful in a moment so public. The priest, who had remained silent through much of the ordeal, finally spoke, his voice gentle. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the greatest vows are not the ones spoken at the altar, but the ones we make in our hearts to live in truth. What we have witnessed here is painful, yes, but it is also sacred. Truth has been revealed, and lives have been saved from a path that was never meant to be." His words, though brief, carried wisdom that settled over the church like a balm. The bride looked around the room one last time, then straightened her shoulders. "This day will not be remembered as the day I was married," she said clearly. "It will be remembered as the day I was given a second chance, the day I was saved from living a life built on lies. And for that I am grateful." The guests, moved by her words, rose to their feet in quiet respect. There was no applause, no cheering, only the solemn recognition that they had witnessed something far more meaningful than a ceremony. They had witnessed the breaking of chains, the power of truth, and the strength of voices that refused to be silenced. The maid's daughter held tightly to her mother's hand as they slowly made their way toward the exit. But before leaving, the bride stopped them. "Please," she said, "do not disappear from my life. I want you both to know that you are not alone. If ever you need anything, you have me." Her words were sincere, and the maid nodded, overwhelmed by gratitude. The church slowly emptied, the guests carrying with them the memory of what had unfolded. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, as though even the heavens had witnessed the storm within those walls. The bride stepped out into the fresh air, the cool breeze touching her tear-stained face. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The pain of betrayal would take time to heal, and the future she had envisioned was gone. But deep in her heart, she also knew that what had happened today was a blessing in disguise. She had been spared a life of hidden cruelty, spared a future of slow heartbreak. And she had been given the chance to start again, stronger and wiser than before. She looked at the maid's daughter, who smiled timidly through her tears and whispered to herself, "Sometimes the smallest voice can carry the greatest truth." And in that moment, though her wedding had ended, her new life had truly begun. The church, once buzzing with whispers of celebration, now stood empty, its pews still carrying the echoes of what had unfolded. The flowers still lined the aisle, the ribbons still fluttered lightly, and the altar still waited for vows that would never be spoken. Outside, the guests walked away slowly, their faces filled with thought, their voices hushed. They had expected to witness love sealed in promise, yet instead they had witnessed truth-breaking chains. And though they had not seen the wedding they came for, they had seen something far more powerful, courage in its purest form. The bride stood quietly beneath the wide oak tree just beyond the church doors. The cool breeze lifted her veil and carried with it the scent of roses from the bouquets that now seemed to belong to another world. Her parents stood close beside her, offering comfort, but she kept her eyes fixed on the maid and her daughter, who lingered a few steps away, unsure if they belonged. She motioned for them to come closer, her eyes soft despite the heaviness of her heart. The maid hesitated, but her daughter tugged her hand gently, pulling her forward with innocent trust. When they reached her, the bride bent down once again and looked into the child's eyes. "You changed everything today," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "You gave me a gift that no one else could. Because of you, I am free. Because of you, I was saved." The little girl lowered her gaze, shy now that the storm had passed, but her mother placed a gentle hand on her back. "She only did what her heart told her to," the maid said softly. "I spent years teaching her to stay silent, to be careful, to avoid trouble. But today she reminded me that sometimes silence is the very thing that gives power to what should never be hidden. She has been braver than I have ever been." The bride reached for the maid's hands and squeezed them gently. "Do not speak of yourself as weak," she said firmly. "You carried more than anyone should have to carry, and you endured for your daughter. That is strength too. And today, when it mattered most, you stood with her. You broke the silence together." The maid's tears fell freely, but for the first time in years they were not born only of fear or exhaustion. They were tears of release, of a burden lifted from her shoulders. She nodded slowly, her heart swelling with gratitude that her truth had finally been spoken, even if it had taken the courage of a child to bring it into the light. As the guests dispersed, some approached quietly to speak to the bride, offering words of comfort. Yet many also turned to the maid and her daughter, their expressions softened with newfound respect. For years they had overlooked them, treating them as invisible, but now they saw them for what they truly were, the ones who had carried the truth into the open, the ones who had saved the bride from a lifetime of hidden sorrow. In the weeks that followed, the story of that day spread far beyond the church walls. People spoke not only of the broken wedding, but of the child whose small voice had changed the course of a life. They spoke of the maid, who had endured quietly for so long but found the strength to stand beside her daughter when it mattered most. And they spoke of the bride, who chose honesty over illusion, courage over comfort, even when it cost her the future she had planned. The groom, once admired for his charm and status, found that the mask he had worn no longer held power. Whispers followed him wherever he went, whispers that carried doubt, disappointment, and truth. His name no longer shone with respect, for people had seen the cracks in his character, and no wealth or charm could cover them again. The bride, though heartbroken, began to rebuild her life with a new sense of purpose. She devoted herself to her work, her family, and the quiet healing of her spirit. Each day was difficult at first, but she carried within her the memory of that little girl's voice, reminding her that truth, no matter how painful, was always better than the most beautiful lie. She no longer ignored the whispers of her own heart. Instead, she honored them, trusting her instincts in a way she never had before. The maid and her daughter continued their lives too, but something had changed for them. No longer did they walk with heads bowed in silence. The maid discovered a quiet pride in herself and her daughter, realizing that though the world had often treated them as small, their voices carried more weight than they had ever imagined. Her daughter, once timid, grew with a confidence that came from knowing she had spoken when no one else would. Together they carried forward the lesson of that day, that silence is not always strength, and that even the smallest voice can stop the greatest mistake. Years later, when people remembered that wedding, they did not remember the flowers or the music or the gown. They remembered the cry of a child breaking through the silence. They remembered the moment when truth stood taller than pride, when honesty shattered illusion. They remembered it not as a ruined wedding, but as a turning point, a moment that reminded everyone of the power of speaking when silence feels safer. The bride often looked back on that day with both sorrow and gratitude. She mourned the dream she lost, but she was thankful for the truth that replaced it. She knew now that courage did not always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came in a small voice, a trembling plea, a child standing alone in a crowded room, and she carried that lesson with her always.